Meanwhile, just staying with another important facet of our COVID coverage that we need to talk about today. On Sunday, the central government filed an affidavit in the Supreme Court during an ongoing case in which they talked about what they have done so far for those who died of COVID-19. Now, that was the primary purpose of that affidavit. But another important point that they make on page 40 of that affidavit is also that penal action will be taken against those who are undercounting or underreporting COVID-19 deaths. Now, this becomes important in the context of claims, reports that several Indian states are underreporting COVID-19 deaths. We've in fact seen that happening in the states of Madhya Pradesh and Bihar. So now what the central government is saying is that they will penalize those who do this. Abhimanyu is joining us with more details on what has been said in that affidavit.
The Supreme Court has asked the centre to ensure a strict mechanism to correct death certificates which have been issued earlier which did not mention COVID as a reason behind the death of a COVID positive person. The court has made it clear that families of deceased COVID patients who got wrong death certificates earlier should not be denied ex gratia compensation on the basis of lack of issuance of a COVID death certificate, and certificates need to be upgraded in line with the current policy. Centre had earlier maintained before the top court that failure to report COVID death will make everyone responsible in the administration, including the certifying doctor, for penal consequences, claiming that a statutory mechanism is already in place to report COVID deaths. The guidelines are backed by the force of law and also by a 2020 order of the top court. Non-reportage of COVID deaths is a criminal offence under section 188 of the IPC, and guidelines issued by the Office of Registrar General of India are being followed to report cause of deaths. In May 2021, the Registrar General of India had issued guidelines to register death of a person within 21 days, and goal of certification of cause of death was to correctly classify all COVID deaths. All deaths with COVID diagnosis, irrespective of comorbidities, are to be classified as deaths due to COVID.
All right, Dr. Vishal Rao of the Karnataka COVID Task Force is joining us just for some perspective of why this is happening. Dr. Rao, thank you so much for speaking with us on the India development debate. Now, let's look at what has happened in a few states, including Karnataka, where reconciliations of data has led to a much higher number of casualties being reported for COVID-19. In some cases, it's 6 times or so of what was initially reported. That is alarming to think that we're possibly underreporting the numbers of those who are dying from COVID-19. Can you explain to us why you think this is happening?
So I think, a lot of the data that comes out on a real-time basis comes from a process of reporting. Now, you need to understand how deaths get reported, and that's a very important understanding, Tamanna, on how deaths get reported. The first important thing is, when a death happens, we need to understand, does the death happen at home? Does it happen in an institution? Now, the institution can be it can be medical, or it can be a non-medical institution, or it can be at a public place. There are 3 ways in which deaths can happen. Primarily, what we saw in the pandemic was that there were a lot of deaths in institutions, whereas also a lot of deaths in non-institutions and homes. The process of reporting requires you to fill up a Form 2 and a Form 4. And if it's non-institution, a Form 4A. A lot of data collation happens, and generally on a regular basis you see these kind of formalities. And I've personally also faced this in a lot of calls that we received, where patients, some of them who died at home, did not know how to go across and get the Form 4A filled because the death had happened at home and the patient either was brought dead to the hospital. So these are complex scenarios, which is why there could be sometimes gaps in the data uploading at times on a day-to-day basis. So also what has happened is a lot of these deaths that happened in patients who died but did not get themselves tested for COVID could be another contributing reasons. So a lot of aspects of technology here, which is important, that is from the time of the death to the filling up of the forms to collating the data and then uploading it, is the one that I think would be one of the most common reasons to see some of these gaps.
You know, Dr. Rao, that's all well said, and I'm sure that the process is complicated, but two factors which come to mind which need an explanation. One is that those who have got COVID-19 but then eventually die of post-COVID complications are sometimes not being counted as COVID deaths, because at the time of death, they are no longer COVID positive. They may have tested COVID negative, but they are suffering from post-COVID complications, which may lead to death because of a lung collapse or cardiac arrest, etc. They are not being counted. And the second is some sort of a pressure which comes in from authorities and the administration to show fewer deaths. It may be because they want to give out less compensations, or they don't want to show higher numbers. It makes them look bad. Then questions on governance arise. What about these situations?
True. I think this is a very important point. I know it's generally a very tight spot to kind of show that these many people died, and it looks bad to show. Is it because of lack of active response? And these are the kind of things that often are spoken as controversies. Now, the most important thing, and one of the important things that you raised, see, in Karnataka, for example, when they give the daily report, we always see that there is a COVID-related deaths and non-COVID-related deaths. So that if you have got it into the register, and it's important to know that every death, finally, if it has to go into a cremation ground, has to have a death certificate. So it's so important that the data will get registered. It cannot get escaped there. There may be a time lag, but you cannot escape that data. The data will come in, and that's possibly one of the reasons where you're seeing this reconciliation, because these data are going to come up. However, in this process, a lot of the time, what is important to collate is deaths which are happening from COVID and non-COVID both, because I've also firmly believed that non-communicable diseases during this process got neglected, and a lot of patients who died, which is because of non-communicable diseases not being addressed, are also equally accountable today. So I think there is a larger aspect to be looked into here, where states should report COVID-related and non-COVID-related deaths, because both of them for the state are equally important. And it's also equally important for us to compare this data from the previous year, because if at the same period of time, if you had lesser deaths in that previous year, then we will need to re-question on where are we missing this data.
You know, the implications are several. The implications are also, remember, for insurance policies. You now have COVID-specific insurance policies for life insurance, for medical insurance. So the rules have to be clear, and there should not be an attempt to whitewash what is going on. I have Dr. Jayalal of the Indian Medical Association with me as well. Dr. Jayalal, how do you feel about those who are not certifying correctly being held responsible, including doctors? That's what the central government says in its affidavit. Yeah, okay, I don't think I can hear Dr. Jayalal very clearly. Let me go back to Dr. Rao. Dr. Rao, just one more point, and the same one. How do you feel about having those who are responsible for the process being held liable and penal action taken against them, including doctors?
No, I think it's important to know that this is an extremely important, vital data, and we've been talking about it, that this data, whether it comes from COVID, non-COVID, or vaccine-related complications, is absolutely vital, and you cannot be fudging this data. You cannot be fudging any of such data. It is the ethical practices of a medical practitioner. It is the ethical responsibility of every single medical practitioner to report correct deaths, and it is mandatory to do so. I don't think there should be any ifs and buts about it, or any discussion to say that there was any reasoning for this. So I would strongly support that, yes, if there is such kind of an attempt to illegally manipulate some data, there should be some penal action for this, whichever platform this was done.
Absolutely. We cannot have a situation where people are not being counted for having died with COVID-19. That's just terrible. They deserve at least that dignity in death.